So, today, are you ready for a German lesson from somebody who doesn't know German? Wow, you guys are really interactive today. Are you ready for a German lesson from somebody? I'm not qualified at all. Anybody in the room speak German? Okay, well, I don't trust you. So, I'm going to go ahead and call the bluff and say nobody in the room knows if I'm wrong, but all the people who are online watching us right now can fact check, okay? In German, there is a different way, a different option available to you if you're trying to communicate a concept. In English, you pretty much just have to write out sentences and form paragraphs, and it takes a little while. In German, you can actually take multiple words and just squish them together to say entire, huge amounts of information. So, if you're studying biblical studies or German, you have to learn what's called theological German, because biblical scholars from the 60s onward, instead of writing huge volumes and massive paragraphs, just coin new words. You have to learn those things to even engage in the discipline. If you did this in third grade English, your teacher would slap you on the hand and be like, no, you can't do that. Put the space in there, just use more words and use punctuation. But in German, they're like, hey, less is more, right? Why say in 20 words what I can say in one word that's got 19 squished together, okay? So I'm telling you that because I want to introduce you to a German word that's actually two words and show you just how much meaning is jammed in there. Are you ready? Here's the word I want to teach you today. Weltschmerz. Weltschmerz. It's a complicated word. W's in German are V's. So go ahead. I know you want to try it. Turn to your socially distanced neighbor and say it. Weltschmerz. Come on. There we go. We got a few people participating in the moment. This is actually a word that's two words squished together. If you were to just put a space in it, it would mean world pain or world kind of anxiety or angst, okay? But when you squish the two words together, there's so much more included in the concept. In fact, there's an internal and external dimension to this. The term was coined in the Brothers Grimm, which is a pretty old text, kind of collection of fairy tales and stories in German culture, and it's meant to describe externally what you feel when you look at the chaos of the world, right? There's so much pain. There's so much stuff that's unexplained. There's so many problems that when you look outside, you're just like, man, something is wrong, right? Weltschmerz. That is the feeling. So you experienced that this week when you saw a man with a knee on his neck who ends up dying, and the world goes into flames, right? Our society is literally burning itself down right now because we can't give voice to how we're feeling about this. We just kind of have to act out and do different things. Everybody is experiencing that external dimension of Weltschmerz this week. You didn't necessarily know how to give it voice. The Germans said, well, we've got a word for you. This is what it looks like to look outside and be like, oh, there's so much wrong. Where do we even begin? But there's an internal dimension too. Remember, Germans, they really mess you up with this stuff. There's so much communicated in this term. Internally, it's not just the feeling of seeing the world around you in chaos. It's also this kind of inner yearning, like I was supposed to play a role. There was something I could have or should have done that I didn't. Like maybe, just maybe, the chaos that's out there is due in part because I didn't play the role, the particular role that I was supposed to play. That's that inner dimension of Weltschmerz. That I was supposed to participate, I didn't, and things only got worse. In Western civilization, outside of the Germanic culture, we have a word for this in a particular season. It's called a midlife crisis. Okay? This is the feeling we get when our world shifts and changes and we see trouble out there and trouble in here. We're like, I don't know what to do about it. When we wake up and we feel like the bulk of our life is behind us and the dreams that we had as a kid or a young adult never really kind of ended up being what we expected them to be. We made great decisions though, right? Because you learned through our series, if you've been paying attention, to develop some grit during that first young adult season of life. You've been grinding. And you knew that as you were raising a family and investing in your marriage, that's where you needed to put your effort and energy. So you've done it. You've made great decisions. And you've raised up good kids you're proud of. Like maybe they're starting to get married or they're going off to college. And you're like, man, it's so great to see them. But as they leave the nest, right? You're like, now where do I put the grit? tenacity and the energy and the effort? What happens if you invested in your kids, but you didn't really invest in your spouse, and then they leave and you're like, man, I don't even know if we're friends anymore? Or you're retiring out of a job that you've done for 35 years, you never even really loved it, now you're like, what now? Right? The midlife season in our culture is somewhere from like 40 to 65, though I believe that people can go through this sort of crisis moment way younger, especially in our society today. It's this feeling like I missed something. And there's a problem in me and out there that I should have been fixing earlier in life. So what do we do to compensate for that loss, right? We're disillusioned, we're disenfranchised, we don't know what's going on. Well, stereotypically, for like 50-year-old white males, you buy a sports car, right? That's the stereotypical midlife crisis. Or maybe you say, hey, I want to develop a new hobby, and we go back to school, adult ed, or you start a new career, or you start buying the same clothes that your kids wear, right? Like, there's all different ways that this kind of manifests itself, consciously or subconsciously. I want to ask today, though, how do we remain faithful to God in those seasons of life where we just don't know who we are anymore? And we don't know where we're supposed to be directing our energy, physical, financial, spiritual, whatever. And I feel like a lot of people feel like that now because we're having to create such a new normal. Like, what do I do now, God? I want to figure out how to remain faithful to God when the world is burning around us and it feels like it's burning inside as well. So, I want you to know today that the midlife crisis moment is so common. It happens to practically everybody in some way, shape, or form. So don't feel like you're singled out or unique. However, in the ancient world, which we're about to dive into reading the scriptures, there wasn't such thing as a midlife crisis. You know why? Because most people didn't make it to age 45. The average lifespan was pretty low, so you couldn't go through a stereotypical midlife crisis in Western mindset in the 21st century because you just didn't get that old. But it doesn't mean that people still didn't feel that same yearning, the disconnection between the pain outside and the pain inside, and trying to figure out, God, what am I supposed to do? So today, if you're searching, if you're in a season where you're like, man, where do I go next, God? What's the next thing for me? I hope that we can learn from the experiences of our good OG Moses. Because before there were midlife crises, we've got this Egyptian prince who goes through them. That sure sounds like it to me. So if you want to open your Bible today, you can get to Exodus chapter 2. That's where we're going to end up. Moses is introduced to us as a stereotypical ancient Near Eastern hero. Like, this dude is abandoned at birth, shot down a river, rescued by a princess, raised royal, and then rebels against his own nation and emancipates his people and gives the law from God. Like, this dude, you can tell, is built for a lot. In fact, I won't get into it, but if you dig into the text, you can tell who he's going to be from the get-go. It's amazing. But before he becomes this great Moses of history that we reflect on, like, man, that dude was amazing. There'll never be one like him again. He went through a midlife crisis where he had no clue who he was. So let's check it out today. Exodus 2 picks up the story after he's been adopted and raised into Pharaoh's household. It says, many years later. This is a season shift, okay? Many years after being adopted, when Moses had grown up. So think of him as somebody who's kind of in that midlife season. He went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews. And he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. Now, before we continue the story, I want to ask, what made Moses leave the cushy palace life? Like, what now, many years later, when he grew up, made him, had the impulse to venture out among his old people that he had nothing to do with anymore? What drove him to do that? Well, we can't know. We can't ask him. But David Paul Tripp, who's a kind of theologian of sorts, wrote a book on midlife crises, and he believes that there's a bunch of D words that can launch us into this moment or this season in our lives. Are you ready for this barrage of D words? Dissatisfaction, disorientation, discouragement, dread, disappointment, disinterest, distance, distraction. I don't know what D's apply to you today. I don't even really know what D's applied to Moses in that moment. But I do know this. When he got out and saw his people, and he saw the suffering around him and felt like he was supposed to play a role, when Weltschmerz, in all of its kind of complete meaning, came to roost in his life, he did something. Here's what he does. Verse 12. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. That is a serious impulse action, is it not? Ladies and gentlemen, it could be worse than your husband going out and buying a sports car during his midlife crisis, right? At least he didn't impulse kill somebody, okay? Moses has this drastic action because of some driving force and dissatisfaction with what's happening in his life and what's happening around him. And he tries to fill in the gap. And he kills this dude, and it doesn't go as he expected. He hides it, thinks he's going to get away with it. He comes back the next day, and everybody's like, "You're the dude who killed the Egyptian." Then he freaks out, and his Pharaoh even tries to kill him, so he has to run away. He ends up in Midian. Ellsworth Callis talks about, he's a scholar and a former president of Asbury Theological Seminary. He talks about this moment in Moses' life profoundly. So I just want to quote you a tiny bit of what he says here. He says, "This crisis time is the occasion for opportunity in Moses' life. And maybe your crisis moment is the opportunity that God has been waiting for in your life." He says, "I believe this is the moment when Moses is restless enough and susceptible to the idealism that had been buried in him for years. At an early age, he was preoccupied, we would expect, with wealth and power being raised in Pharaoh's household. But at this midlife crisis moment, he has come to wonder if wealth and power are really worth that much. You ever been there? He starts to ask himself, what am I doing that's good? What in me is actually worthwhile? One needs, so says Ellsworth Callis, an inner crisis like this to do this reevaluating work when life is uncomfortable. And for most people, this inner crisis happens at midlife, which is just a basic uncomfortable period of time. But then he asks a question which is important. It's where we're moving for the rest of this message. Where is God during this moment? Where is God during your disillusionment? Where is God during these crazy actions you take during this midlife season? This is what he says. God is right where he's always been, using the circumstances and common stuff of our lives for divine and eternal purposes. God, who knows our psyche better than we do, speaks to us with particular poignancy, a uniqueness, at these times in our lives where we're susceptible to his divine voice. Now, chances are, nobody in the room was born a slave and raised royal, right? Most of you are probably just scrapping by your bootstraps to put food on the table, pay your car bills and your utilities and your mortgage and stuff during this life. You weren't preoccupied with wealth or power. But I believe that if you're experiencing that same sort of crisis moment, that feeling that, like, I don't know who I'm supposed to be right now and where I'm supposed to go, that God can speak to you today with the same sort of power and precision that he did for Moses in the story that we're about to walk through. Because Moses accepts an invitation to settle in Midian, and this is what the text says. As he settled there, in time, Reuel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah to be his wife, and later she gave birth to a son. And Moses named him Gershom, for he explained, I have been a foreigner in a foreign land. Think about this for a second. How bad does your midlife crisis and identity crisis have to be for you to name your kid after your own suffering? That's what happens here. He names his kid after his midlife crisis. You know he's in the depths, right? So if you feel today really disillusioned, somebody who's a heroic faith figure has been there before. But this next verse is both gospel and pain. Are you ready? Moses is so far down in the dirt that he names his kid after his midlife crisis. You'd expect God to show up in that moment and change things. Here's the next verse. Years passed. Years passed, and he was in that gap. Years passed, and he didn't know who he was supposed to be. Years passed, and he felt like a foreigner in a foreign land. God, who am I supposed to be right now? I heard you before, and I knew who I was supposed to be, but I don't know who I'm supposed to be right now. I don't know if any of you feel that way today. But it continues. Years passed, and the king of Egypt died. But the Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their help rose to God. Prototypically, Moses is yearning for God, and his people are yearning for God, and that intersection is where there is breakthrough. Verse 24 says, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promises with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he looked down on his people and decided it was time to act. Now, theologically, God never checked out of the equation. God never forgot the covenant. God always wanted to bring refreshing spiritual oomph to Moses. He always wanted to deliver his people, but God works on a scale and has a plan way bigger than we do. And sometimes our uncomfortable season is part of this bigger plan that God is bringing to birth in the world. See, Moses had to go through this uncomfortably long midlife crisis season so that God could bring about a deliverance of so many more people. Can I tell you today that maybe your crisis and your confusion is going to be used to bring more people to God? That in and of itself puts us in the same camp of Moses who suffered and Jesus who suffered himself to bring more people to his Father. So maybe we got to lean into that uncomfortable suffering a little bit today. Perhaps this feeling that you've got in your gut, not knowing who you are or where you're supposed to be in this moment, might last more than today. You may not get breakthrough just because I preached on it. But here's what the text tells us. This season comes to a close. It comes to a close for Moses. It comes to a close for Jesus. It will come to a close for you. You know why? Because God is faithful and he has a plan for you. If you're breathing, he ain't done with you yet. There's a new thing for you. Here's how I know this. Moses' crisis lasted for years. In fact, 40 or so. But there is breakthrough that happens in his life because he remains positioned to hear from God even through his suffering. This is where we get Exodus chapter 3. One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Remember this moment? And Moses stares in amazement because the bush is engulfed in flames, but it won't burn up. And he says, "This is amazing! This is amazing. Why isn't this bush burning up? I got to go check this out. I got to get closer. I got to be in the presence." And so when the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush and said, "Moses, Moses." There's purpose to the repetition. "Moses, Moses." And Moses responds, "Here I am." Here I am. "Okay, God, what's next?" Here's what's next. God says, "Go. I am sending" who? "You to lead my people out of Israel." And Moses goes, "Who? Is there somebody behind the bush or something? Like, you don't mean me? No. That's too big a calling for me." And God says, in not so many words, "You're asking the wrong question. You're asking, are you big enough for this calling? You should be asking, is my God big enough for this calling? You're asking, who am I, Lord? You should be asking, who are you, Lord?" And so he does. Moses says, "Well, what is going on?" He asks for the divine name himself. And God responds in this typical thing, which we'll get to in just a second. "I am who I'm going to be," is essentially what the text is going to say. Peter Enns, who's a world-class scholar, Hebrew scholar out of Harvard, comments on this passage that we're about to read, where God gives him, displays the divine name and speaks into Moses' sense of deficiency with his sufficiency, saying this. Here's the quote. "The I am is with Moses. Moses' assertion that he cannot do the task is correct, right on the money, but beside the point, because he's not the one doing the saving. Moses says, 'I can't do this.' Yahweh responds, 'You're not, I am.'" Let's get this in perspective today. The call that God has on your life is not to be fulfilled simply by you alone, but the one who lives inside of you. The God who raised Jesus from the dead is able to complete the work that he's begun in you and have you actually contribute to the world and make it a better place, to somehow bring resolution to the dissatisfaction in your life. He has a new calling for you, and he's big enough to lead you through it. Now, Moses, when he asks for the divine name, is doing a little bit of song and dance, because in the ancient world, they believed if you knew somebody's name, then you knew their character. Because just like Moses did, you'd name people after the circumstances of their birth or their heritage, and so they believed character was kind of permanent. If I knew your name, then I know who you are and what you're going to do. So if I know your name, I have expectations for you. So Moses is saying, "Hey, God, can I get to know who you is? So I can somehow control this situation and know what to expect?" And God says, "No, homie, don't play that." Here's what God's going to do. He says, "I'll give you a name, all right. How about this one? I am who I'm going to be, not who you say I am. I am who I say I am. Take that another step. Moses, you are who I say you are. Take that another step. Go tell the Israelites, they are who I say they're going to be. You catch the cascading, trickling theological significance of this name? We are rooted in who God says we are and the plan that he has for us, not our own disillusionments and deficiencies and dissatisfaction. So here's what the text tells us. It gives us an ironclad formula for responding faithfully to God during your midlife crisis moment. Are you ready for it? It's pretty simple. God calls us, we respond. He commissions us. If we're anything like Moses, we duke it out for a little in battle, but then ultimately God fulfills the promise. God calls us, we respond. He commissions us, gives us what we ask for. We try to barter with him because we feel like we can't handle it. And then he ultimately brings his promises to pass. Remember the story? Moses approaches the bush. God says, Moses, Moses. You know why he repeated his name? It's a guess, but it's a good scholarly guess. In the ancient world and in the Old Testament specifically, when deities addressed people, they would say their name twice to make sure that they were listening. Make sure that you know this voice is coming from God. You're not hearing this random voice in your heart. Like, this is God speaking to you. God is calling your name. And so today, maybe you're not hearing your name audibly twice from a burning bush, okay? Might be a little weird. But maybe if you've been hearing the same thing over and over again, if you've been waking up from a dream multiple times in a row, if you felt this dissatisfaction but this direction for a couple of months or a couple of years, maybe God actually is speaking to you. The repetition might be some direction that it really is coming from God. God calls us. How do we respond? What's Moses' response? He says, here I am. I'm listening. I'm ready for the word. You know how we often respond? That ain't God. Or if that's God, I ain't got time for that. We know because God is direct. I don't know how he speaks to you, but God speaks to us through his word, in our hearts, in our prayers, through songs, maybe even audibly. Right? You know it's God. How do you respond? I know tons of people who tell me, I knew it was God 20 years ago. Didn't listen. I know God's telling me this right now, but I'm afraid and I'm scared. I know this is God, but I don't got time for this. I got family, I got kids, I got bills. How do we respond? We have to be able to get to the place where we respond, here I am. Because most of the time, we don't even let God get it out of his mouth. We're afraid he hasn't even outlined the plan yet. If we say, Lord, here I am, I'm ready, I'm listening, he commissions us. What's he do for Moses? He says, I've heard your prayers. Even the ones you couldn't get out. I know the dissatisfaction in you. I know you're longing for something more. And I've heard the dissatisfaction, the longing of other people. I'm coupling these things together, big boy. We're going to do a serious act. People are going to chant your name for years and years. You will be famous for generations. And Moses says, I don't know about all that. Because after the commissioning, a lot of times there's a battle. I experienced this in my own life with my calling. When God called me to ministry, I was like, no. God, I know this is you, but you done got this one wrong. I imagine there's some duking in your life. When you hear from God, you're like, how about some give and take here? And you know what's amazing is we have a God who doesn't just like squish us like ants when we say no or when we want to give a little bit. Remember him bartering with Abraham? Remember him bartering with Moses? Moses does this a bunch of times. He becomes a great negotiator with God. God is big enough to withstand your fears and concerns. You can voice them to him. It's going to be okay. But you know what we ultimately have to do? And what Moses ultimately does after the battle? Is surrender to him. And when we surrender to him, the call, the response, the commission, God fulfills his promises. Every stinking time. He does it for Moses. He goes, he liberates his people, he gives them the law, he does everything he said he was going to do. Do you know he's still in the business of keeping his promises today? If you're in this crisis moment, you don't know where you're supposed to be, but you know you've been hearing God, or maybe God's speaking to you right now, listen, duke it out if you must, but surrender, because God is faithful to do what he said he's going to do. So here's the whole point of the message. Are you ready? Sum it all up in one line. Your midlife crisis, I believe, is really your midlife calling. You think you missed it? You think it's past you? No. Better days are yet to come. If you're breathing, God's not done with you. If you're dissatisfied, he's got a purpose. He's got a plan. Your destiny might be something you still need to walk into. It took Moses 80 stinking years to walk into his destiny. What makes you think you can't right now? What excuse do you have better than Moses? I'm 80, I got a family, I'm not even from there, I killed a guy. If I go back, they're going to kill me. Can you come up with a better excuse than Moses to step into your calling today in your midlife moment? Let's recap. The text tells us we are likely to experience dissatisfaction, disillusionment, discouragement, all of the D's in our life. But if we continue to listen for God, he is faithful to speak to us and give us direction. Your season might not end today, right? Just because I preached on it doesn't mean it's a mysterious gift where you're going to get out of it. But maybe he's stirring something in you and working in you. Maybe you're yet to have that burning bush moment for you, whatever that looks like. But I believe that if we're faithful to listen, we're searching after him, even when it feels dry, even when it feels like investing spiritually is giving us no return. God is active and he's at work in something. Maybe there's a bigger story, folks, going on around you. Listen. The Weltschmerz inside of you only has one solution. It's called the hope of Jesus Christ. And when you're suffering and you feel afraid and alone, know that Jesus came and did that with you. He came out of heaven, and he came in the form of a human. And he suffered and died. He was in the wilderness by himself. He experienced all of this pain, right? Nothing you've gone through, no questioning you've gone through hasn't gone through with him. He literally on the cross was like, God, where are you? But that same moment where he asked where God was the moment that God gave breakthrough to the entire stinking world. Who says he can't do something powerful in you today when your midlife crisis turns into a midlife calling? You don't suffer in vain. You don't suffer alone. And God is about ending suffering with his hope. This is Paul's entire intention in his writing of Romans 5. Just listen to this really quick as you're experiencing this issue and crisis moment or season in your life. It says, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, like kids going away, like retirement, like trying to change our seasons, trying to figure out how do I continue to be who I'm supposed to be and jump into a new career path when I don't know the tech, I don't have the degree, I stopped training for the NFL when I was 10, how am I going to embrace this next season? We can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance, and endurance develops strength of character. And character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. And this hope will not lead to disappointment, for we know how dearly God loves us because he has given us the Holy Spirit to fill our hearts with his love. So if you're experiencing this dry season, theologically, people have called it the dark night of the soul. If you're confused about who you are, where you're supposed to go now, don't leave your wife. Don't buy a motorcycle. Don't destroy everything you bought. No offense, Dan. Don't destroy everything you've built in your life. Don't tarnish your legacy. Because breakthrough is on the horizon if we're listening for God. It might take a while to hear his voice, but I promise he's still in the business of speaking. And he's still in the business of